African History, the 1944 Brazzaville French-African Conference. The 1944 Brazzaville French-African Conference. This was a meeting of senior French colonial officials, governors-general and military officers of French Equatorial Africa, French Congo, Madagascar, Malagasy and French West African colonies. It was held between January and February 1944 in Brazzaville, the capital of French Equatorial Africa. The conference was organized by General Charles de Gaulle, the French leader, and presided over chaired by Mr. Plevin, the Commissioner of Colonies. Africans had no delegates to represent them at the conference, but one black man, Felix Ebao from French Guiana, attended. The Brazzaville Conference was aimed at the following: A. Thank African French colonies for supporting France against German occupation during World War II. B. Lay strategies of diverting Africans under French rule from the idea of self-rule. The Second World War had created political consciousness or wind of change prompting Africans to demand for independence. C. France was threatened by American anti-colonial activities in the Maghreb region, North Africa, especially in Morocco, hence the need to deal with American anti-colonial policy. D. Lay strategies of orienting Africans into managing their own affairs. E. It was to safeguard French interest in Africa and preserve French colonies from outside influence. F. To plan for economic development of French colonies. G. De Gaulle also targeted asking Africans for more war contributions since World War II was not yet over. This was only by promising Africans political changes. Note: the conference was not aimed at preparing Africans for decolonization, hence its positive impact on Africa was by accident. Final resolution at Brazzaville clearly stated that the works of France and her African colonies have no consideration of autonomy, independence and self-government in near future. Impact of the Brazzaville Conference on the decolonization of Africa. Reference questions. How did the calling of the Brazzaville Conference in 1944 influence the collapse of French rule in Africa? B. Assess the impact of the 1944 Brazzaville Conference on the decolonization of Africa. C. Of what impact was Brazzaville Conference on African nationalism? 1. The Brazzaville Conference increased African representation in the French Parliament National Assembly in Paris. Delegates at the conference resolved that all colonial peoples deserved to represent themselves in the Paris Assembly. Hence, from 1945, French African territories were each required to send 2 representatives to the French National Assembly. The resolution of Africans representing themselves in the French Assembly was later included in the Constitution of the French Fourth African History, the 1944 Brazzaville French-African Conference. Influence. As a result, 1 million Africans in the French colonies got empowered to participate in the election of representatives of their choice, like Félix Houphouët Boigny of Ivory Coast and Léopold Sédar Senghor of Senegal. The rewarding of Africans of voting rights prompted them to demand for more political rights, including the sovereign right to self-determination. 3. The conference provided for the establishment of native assemblies, territorial parliaments in the French African colonies. These native or local parliaments empowered Africans to play local politics through electing local representatives to discuss solutions to problems created by the French colonial system. In the same way, French colonies witnessed political growth as many political organizations were created to compete for political participation and representation in the French Assembly and local parliaments. 4. Consequently, Africans were given civil rights like freedom of association, which enabled them to form mass political associations that actively involved in the decolonization process. These modern political associations were formed either at regional or country level. They included the Independance des Frémeurs IOM and the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain RDA. The RDA was formed in 1946 with representative branches in Equatorial and French West Africa and was very instrumental in influencing political concessions changes. Other parties included Bloc Démocratique Sénégalais XPDS, formed in 1948, Union Soudanese US Party, Démocratique de la Guinée PDG, founded in 1947. 5. The Brazzaville Conference promoted the status of Africans in French territories, which inspired African nationalism. The French authorities agreed to grant Africans in French colonies equal status as Frenchmen and also recognize them as equals to French citizens. The abolition of French harsh colonial policies and the granting of Africans voting rights and representation in the French Parliament, as well as spreading French civilization in Africa, were all steps towards granting Africans equal status as Frenchmen. The intention of granting Africans equal status as Frenchmen was aimed at diverting their attention from demanding self-rule, but instead it exposed the weaknesses of French rule, causing African resistance. Out of 16 million Africans in French West Africa, only 1 million could vote, and of the 622 seats in French Parliament, Africans were given only 13 seats. 6. The Brazzaville Conference called to an end French atrocities, bad colonial policies which the French government claimed had tarnished the image of France. The conference cautioned the colonial authorities in French, Equatorial and West Africa to reverse the harsh policies in order to win back African trust. Consequently, the policies of forced labor and arbitrary arrest without trial which African history, the 1944 Brazzaville French African Conference. Development of overseas territories fights to spearhead investment projects in their colonies. Between 1946 and 1957, France had invested about £425 million in West African transport, roads, education and health. Such developments facilitated the road to independence in French colonies of Guinea, Senegal, and Ivory Coast, among others. 8. The Brazzaville Conference recommended the extension of French civilization to French Africa through Western education and French language. The French government instructed the Colonial Office to establish educational institutions in French colonies through which free education would be extended to Africans. The French civilization program facilitated the rise of African elites who later engaged in political activities aimed at achieving self-government. 9. The French delegates at the conference resolved to change the status of the French territories in Africa from provinces to colonies. The conference abolished the use of overseas territories in regard to French colonies. The status of African colonies as overseas territories or provinces had destroyed all African hopes of regaining their lost freedoms through constitutional means. Referring to French territories as colonies restored a ray of hope of Africans finally becoming free and independent from French domination. 10. De Gaulle's speech in Brazzaville was of political influence to French Africa. He said, "It is France's duty to raise the Africans to a level where they will be capable of participating in their ram country." He therefore commanded governors-general in French colonies to recruit Africans in the different administrative departments as well as the civil service. Many Africans got appointed to administrative offices as clerks and administrators, while others served in the civil service. This colonial arrangement exposed Africans to leadership and service, which became a stepping stone to agitate for bigger political roles in their respective states, thus shaking the pillars of French rule. 11. It laid the foundation for the de Gaulle referendum of 1958, which increased hope for independence in French West Africa. Aware of the political agitations across Africa, General de Gaulle decided to determine the fate of French rule in Africa. He began by influencing the formation of the Federation of French Colonies of West Equatorial Africa. In 1958, de Gaulle organized a plebiscite referendum in which French colonies of West Africa would decide to be colonized and lose French support or remain under the French Federation and continue receiving French moral, financial and technical support. Sékou Touré led the Guineans to vote in favor of independence, and on October 2, 1958, Guinea's was independence declared. Guinea's African history, the 1944 Brazzaville French African Conference.